noticed her. But one day he decided to follow her, just out of curiosity. 20 minutes later, he was standing in the dark, unable to believe his eyes. It wasn't cheating. It wasn't stealing. It was something much stronger. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments where you're watching this video. The mansion stood solemn and immaculate at the edge of the Beacon Hill where old money met older silence. Wrapped in sharp lines of modern architecture and encased in stone and glass, the estate gave no hint of the life inside, if there was life to speak of. Jonathan Crane had lived in the house for 6 years, 5 of them alone. The first year, before the cancer swept through her like fire through silk, the house had been something else. A home, perhaps. But in the years since Rebecca died, it had become a hollow machine. A shrine without worship. A perfect prison of his own design. The rooms were spotless. The garden, maintained by an outsourced team, bloomed dutifully. The kitchen gleamed with unused cookware. The housekeeper came, cleaned, and left without trace, except for the faint scent of lemon polish and fresh linen. Jonathan did not entertain guests. His calendar was filled only with board meetings, investment briefings, and the names of 3 men: his lawyer, his financial advisor, and his driver. There was no laughter in the halls, no music in the living room. The wine cellar remained sealed. He spent most of his time in the study upstairs, overlooking the back courtyard, fingers on glass, eyes on ledgers, soul in abeyance. And every morning, precisely at 7 o'clock, Grace arrived. She never rang the doorbell. The gate opened on her approach via pre-programmed sensor recognition, and she entered through the side kitchen entrance. For 2 years, she had done this without exception. Not a minute late. Not a day missed. Rain, snow, or blazing sun. She came as scheduled, wearing the same charcoal gray jacket, navy jeans that hugged her frame without vanity, a pale blouse buttoned to the neck, and the same white sneakers with worn soles and cracked leather edges. And always, always, the black canvas bag slung over her shoulder, held close to her ribs as if it guarded something far more precious than rags and wipes. Jonathan first noticed her on the second week after hiring her, but it took months before he saw her, truly saw her. There was something about the way she moved, calm, controlled, precise. She never dragged her feet, she never sighed, she never paused in motion unless necessary. Her presence was like a hush between heartbeats, neither intrusive nor invisible. He often watched her from the study as she entered the kitchen, pulled her hair into a tight bun, put on thin gloves, and set to work. No wasted gestures, no muttering or humming. She was efficient to the point of silence. If machines had hearts, they would clean like Grace. Jonathan didn't need company, or so he told himself. But some days, when the echo in the halls grew loud enough to remind him that the silence was not peace, but emptiness, he found himself lingering near the kitchen. He'd pour coffee just as she polished the countertop. He'd walk past the living room while she vacuumed, pretending to inspect the furniture she just cleaned. She never said much, just a soft, "Good morning, Mr. Crane," and the occasional "Excuse me," as she passed by. There was something inexplicably noble about her. Her back never slouched, her chin never dropped. Her voice was calm but not submissive. It wasn't the posture of someone beaten down by life. It was the bearing of someone holding herself together for reasons not meant for the world. Jonathan was a man who noticed things. His business demanded it. In mergers and acquisitions, details were everything. Eye contact, tone, the way someone hesitated before signing. And now, more and more, his attention turned toward Grace. She was, after all, the only real person left in his orbit. It started as curiosity, then drifted into concern. Her shoes were degrading visibly, but she didn't replace them. Her bag looked heavy, worn, and strained at the seams. He offered her a performance bonus. She declined. He suggested taking 2 days off a week instead of 1. She thanked him and refused. Each interaction, no matter how gentle, met a quiet wall of politeness and unshakable boundaries. At breakfast one morning, she placed his omelet and toast before him with her usual precision. He was seated at the long marble dining table, alone as always. His coffee was perfectly brewed, his juice freshly squeezed. Grace never erred, not in temperature, not in presentation, not in timing. He studied her as she turned to leave. "Grace," he said. She paused. "Yes, Mr. Crane. This table's a bit large for one person. You're welcome to join me." A soft flicker passed across her face, too fleeting to name. She offered a tight smile. "Thank you, sir, but I have to finish cleaning the study before 9. The same answer she always gave, perfectly respectful, impeccably distant. After she left the room, Jonathan sat alone with his untouched food and an unfamiliar knot in his chest. He wasn't used to being denied, not rudely, not defiantly, but simply and gracefully. Denied nonetheless. That afternoon, he tried to work. The screen glowed with shifting numbers and quarterly reports, but his eyes drifted to the window. Grace was walking through the courtyard with a bucket in one hand and a cloth bundle in the other. She moved with the same quiet strength, but now he noticed something else. She paused slightly as she reached the stairs, breathing slower, her shoulders sagging momentarily under the weight of the bucket before she reset her posture. Later that day, he passed her in the hallway. She was rearranging books in the upstairs sitting room. The angle of her arm as she reached up seemed strained. Her fingers trembled slightly. Something was wrong. "Everything all right?" he asked casually. She looked down immediately. "Just a little dizzy spell. I'll be fine." But her voice was thinner than usual, her skin paler. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the faint tremble in her hands. At lunch, she served his meal but barely touched hers. She had a small plate of rice and a spoonful of vegetables, but moved the food around without really eating. When he offered the rest of his salmon, she shook her head with a mechanical smile. "There's plenty at home, thank you." Another lie. He was beginning to count them. Late in the afternoon, as she was making coffee, he walked past the kitchen and saw her take a small vial from her bag. She glanced around before opening it and quickly swallowed 2 pills with a sip of water. He caught a glimpse of the pharmacy label, an upscale clinic known for importing expensive medications. She placed the vial back into her bag as if it were made of glass and gilt. By the time he stepped into the kitchen, her face was its usual neutral mask. "More coffee, Mr. Crane?" He nodded, watching her. "You're feeling well, I hope?" "A slight headache," she replied evenly. Nothing unusual. But that wasn't true, and now Jonathan knew it. The medicine wasn't for a headache. The fatigue wasn't from overwork. The lies were piling up, small and courteous, but unmistakable. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced the cold floors of the house, remembering every moment of the day, every hesitation, every sigh, every false smile. There was a story hiding behind Grace's quiet diligence, and it was beginning to unravel whether she wanted it to or not. At precisely 7 the next morning, Jonathan was already on the upper veranda when Grace arrived. She entered the gate with her usual calm stride, but now, to him, every motion carried weight. Her walk was slightly slower. She leaned slightly to the left, favoring one leg. He noticed how she clutched her bag tighter than usual, as if afraid it might be taken. During breakfast, he tried a different approach. "Do you live far, Grace?" "Not too far." "Do you have family nearby?" A pause. A flicker of something behind her eyes. "I have children." That was new. The first personal fact she had ever shared in 2 years. He didn't push. He didn't need to. Her voice had cracked slightly when she said it. Her hand trembled as she cleared the dishes. He saw it now. The fatigue wasn't from work. The lies weren't to deceive. They were shields. She was hiding something because she was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. And Jonathan Crane, the man who hadn't truly cared about anything since the day he held Rebecca's cold hand, suddenly cared more than he knew what to do with. That afternoon, she collapsed. It was subtle at first. A stumble, a hand on the wall, a moment of stillness as if the world had gone blurry. Then her legs gave out, and she fell to the floor beside the vacuum cleaner with a thud that seemed to echo through the house. Jonathan was on his feet in seconds. By the time he reached her, she was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin clammy and cold. He lifted her onto the couch and called for an ambulance, his voice shaking for the first time in years. When she opened her eyes minutes later, disoriented and weak, she whispered hoarsely, "Don't call the hospital." "You fainted, Grace. You need—" "No," she said again, louder this time, panic overtaking pain. "Please, don't." Jonathan saw something raw and desperate in her eyes, something that terrified him. She wasn't afraid of illness. She was afraid of being seen. He didn't call the ambulance. Instead, he gave her sugar water, helped her rest, and watched her sleep for a full hour before she insisted on going home. When she left, he followed. 15 minutes later, Jonathan Crane got into his car and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would find out who Grace really was and what she was hiding, and this time he wouldn't stop at the surface. The sky had long turned the color of slate, heavy with November haze, by the time Jonathan slipped behind the wheel of his car. The quiet buzz of the ignition was the only sound as the garage door opened with an obedient hum. It was already dark, and Boston's downtown skyline in the distance glimmered like a cluster of stars stolen from some richer night. He adjusted the mirror, exhaled, and drove. Grace had left nearly 15 minutes earlier, on foot as always, her slender silhouette swallowed quickly by the descending shadows. She walked with that same contained determination she carried through every motion. But after what had happened, after the fainting, the pallor, the deflection, Jonathan could no longer pretend that all was well. Something inside him refused to rest. There was a growing, gnawing insistence that he had been missing something vital, something hidden beneath 2 years of polite distance and perfect professionalism. He followed at a careful distance, headlights off until necessary, taking turns slowly, sometimes pulling over to let space stretch between them. Grace walked fast, but her pace faltered every few blocks. She limped slightly, favoring her right side. Her bag, as always, was tight against her body. The route she took was not a straight shot to any residential area Jonathan recognized. It curved away from Beacon Hill, bypassing the neat rows of historic homes and ducking into streets whose names he had only ever seen on blueprints and zoning permits. The neighborhoods shifted. The brick grew grimier, the shops fewer, the lights dimmer. Eventually, she disappeared around a corner marked with a flickering neon sign that read only Marion Sate, and then was gone. Jonathan parked 2 blocks away, locked the car, and followed on foot. The building she entered was a squat, crumbling two-story structure, wedged between a boarded-up convenience store and a check-cashing outlet. Its facade was streaked with water stains, the paint long surrendered to rust. The windows were grimy, the fire escape bent, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. There was no signage. No lights in the windows, yet she had entered it like someone coming home. Jonathan paused to cross the street, his heart louder than the distant rush of passing traffic. This place was not safe, not for someone like her, not for anyone, really, but she had come here, alone, at the end of a 12-hour day, and had done so, presumably, for some time. He moved closer, angling through an alley that gave him partial view through a high, dusty window. What he saw froze him in place. Inside, in a poorly lit room lined with cots and threadbare blankets, were women. Dozens of them. Some sat hunched together on the floor, sharing plastic containers of food. Others rocked babies. A few dozed in corners. There were children, too, 3 of them gathered around a battered table, coloring with broken crayons, one curled up on a pile of coats near a radiator. And Grace was there among them. No longer in uniform, she had changed into a loose sweater and jeans. Her hair was down. She smiled, genuinely smiled, as she handed a warm bowl of something steaming to a teenager with tear-streaked cheeks. She crouched beside a toddler and wiped his nose gently. She patted an older woman's shoulder, speaking quietly, listening more. Jonathan leaned back against a brick wall behind him, breath catching. This wasn't her second job. It wasn't a shelter, not officially. There were no medical signs, no IDs, no administrative desks. This was something different. This was something clandestine. A sanctuary created not from policy, but desperation. A homemade lifeline for those who had fallen through the cracks. He stayed there for over an hour, watching without being seen. He saw her mop the floor, sew a rip in a child's coat, sort through donated clothes. He watched her haul a crate of canned goods from the back and organize them by expiration date. Nothing about her demeanor resembled fatigue now. She was focused, purposeful, more alive than he'd ever seen her in his home. This place, for all its squalor, was the space where she came alive. Eventually, sometime past 9, she knelt at the far end of the room and opened her black bag. Jonathan instinctively moved closer to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. From within, she pulled out the same vial he had seen earlier that day and took another dose of pills. This time, though, he noticed something else. A medical folder, thick and creased, with a child's name scrawled on the label. She opened it, flipped through pages, and paused at what looked like a scan or an X-ray. Her shoulders tensed. When she looked up again, the light in her eyes had shifted. She wore sorrow like a second skin. Jonathan took a step back. The knot in his chest tightened. There was a child. Sick. And if the folder meant what he thought it did, the child might be hers. He returned to his car in silence. That night, he didn't go home. Instead, he parked in the lot of an all-night diner and sat there with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, eyes fixed on nothing. His mind raced, memories of Grace's tired smile, her silence, her refusals, her lies. They weren't about pride. They were armor. They were the scaffolding she needed to hold herself together for the sake of something, someone else. He thought of Rebecca, and how helpless he had been during her final months, despite the best doctors and the most advanced treatments money could buy. He had held her hand through every chemo session. He had slept in the hard chair beside her bed in the private suite at Mass General. And still, she had slipped away. Nothing had saved her. And now, Grace was trying to save someone with none of those resources. Alone. He returned home just before dawn. The house looked different to him, emptier, colder, like a theater waiting for a performance that would never begin. He walked through the rooms barefoot, staring at the expensive art he never liked, the custom rugs he'd chosen without care, the silent piano in the music room no one had touched since Rebecca. Something cracked open inside him. The next morning, he sat in his study at 6:55 a.m., watching the gate from behind the curtain. Right on time, Grace appeared, her gait stiff, her jacket zipped high against the wind. He watched her every step as if memorizing her path. She entered the kitchen without a word, as always, but when she turned and saw him already seated at the breakfast table, fully dressed, coffee untouched, she paused just for a moment. "Good morning, Mr. Crane," she said, setting her bag in its usual place. He nodded. "Morning, Grace." That day, he didn't work. He followed her with his eyes from room to room, noting every wince, every micro-pause when she thought no one saw. He offered her lunch. She declined. He asked if she was feeling better. She smiled, but her shoulders said otherwise. That afternoon when she left, he followed again. This time, she didn't go straight to the shelter. Instead, she boarded a bus. Jonathan tailed it in his car, nerves sharp. She exited 20 minutes later in a part of the city even more run down than the last. He parked, waited, then followed discreetly. She entered a building marked St. Agnes Free Clinic. A modest structure, part church, part medical facility. Inside, he saw her disappear behind a door marked Pediatrics. The waiting area was half full, children sniffling, mothers with hollow eyes rocking strollers. He sat down in the far corner, hat low, collar up, pretending to read a brochure. 10 minutes later, Grace emerged from the hallway. She held the hand of a child. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. Her skin was a deep brown, her face thin, her eyes too large for her small head. A scarf covered her bald scalp. She wore a bright pink hoodie with faded unicorns and gripped Grace's hand with the quiet urgency of someone who knew too well what loss meant. Grace spoke to the receptionist, her tone soft but firm. Jonathan watched, unmoving. He saw the way the girl leaned into her side, how her lips moved slowly, tiredly. The receptionist handed over a paper. Grace folded it, thanked her, and led the child outside. Jonathan didn't follow them this time. He sat in that plastic chair for several more minutes, staring at the door they had disappeared through. The mystery was gone, and in its place stood the truth, terrible and clear. The pills, the fatigue, the desperate refusal of help. Grace Silva was fighting a war he had once lost. Only now, he was on the outside, watching a woman sacrifice everything for her daughter, without complaint, without support, without rest. And he, wealthy, safe, privileged, had not noticed for 2 years. He rose slowly, went to his car, and drove home. The engine purred, the city blurred, his chest felt hollow as if something had been scooped out. By the time he arrived back at the mansion, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could not let that little girl die. And Grace would never ask for help, so he would have to give it in a way she could accept. Quietly, deliberately, unconditionally, even if it meant unlearning everything he had built his life upon. The morning after the clinic, Jonathan woke early, not from alarm, but from something more urgent and intangible. His sleep had been shallow, laced with images he couldn't shake. The hollow eyes of the little girl, The firm line of Grace's mouth as she took the paper from the receptionist, the fierce tenderness with which the child clung to her side. Her daughter. Her sick, vulnerable, quietly dying daughter. He sat in the dark of his study for a long time, the first rays of sun spilling across his desk like an accusation. He had lived for so long inside his own grief, convinced that his suffering had somehow exempted him from noticing others. But Grace's world was one of constant sacrifice. Hers was not a wound that could be mourned and then buried. It was a battle that had to be fought every hour, every day, without respite, without comfort, without applause. He poured himself a coffee he would not drink and began making calls. By noon, a discreet wire transfer had gone out to a local food bank, but earmarked specifically for the Marion Street Outreach Program. He wasn't even sure the shelter had a name, but the food bank knew the building, and, more importantly, they knew Grace. Another donation followed. To the pediatric clinic at St. Agnes, again through intermediaries, a fresh shipment of medication was scheduled, with the billing handled through one of his foundation's blind accounts. Nothing would bear his name. He wouldn't insult her dignity with charity. She had spent too long being burned by the system she couldn't trust. The following days passed with a surreal mix of tension and control. Grace came to work each morning as usual, with her bag, her composure, her silence. But Jonathan began watching her with a kind of reverence, as if every step she took was sacred. He noticed the way she sometimes braced herself against countertops when she thought no one was looking, how she often skipped lunch, how she paused at the top of the stairs just a second too long before descending. He found himself charting her exhaustion like a weather pattern, anticipating its shifts, sensing when the weight of her second life pressed down harder than usual. She didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't tell her. Instead, he used the tools he knew best: systems, networks, resources. He contacted a local church known for discretion and arranged for new mattresses to be delivered to Marion Street. Then a heating contractor. Then a retired pediatric nurse to visit twice weekly. All under the guise of community outreach initiatives buried in the pages of anonymous philanthropy. If Grace suspected, she said nothing. One evening, he stood at the window and watched as she left, her gait just slightly less burdened. It was a small thing, but it lit a strange, fragile hope in him. Still, not everything improved. One Thursday, he found her in the kitchen late in the afternoon, slumped against the counter, pale and trembling. Her gloves were off, and her hands clutched the edge of the marble like it was the only thing anchoring her. He didn't speak at first. He simply stepped forward and poured her a glass of water. She drank it slowly, her eyes cast down. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and embarrassed. "I didn't eat much today. It's nothing." Jonathan didn't challenge her, though he knew better. He simply nodded and asked her to sit, which she did, reluctantly. He offered her food, which she refused. He offered to call someone, which she firmly declined. The same dance. Always the same. But that night, after she left, he drove straight to the shelter. It was after 9. The street was quiet, and the building, now faintly lit, looked slightly less forgotten. The new furnace had been installed that morning. He hadn't expected to see her there. He had hoped she would rest, but through the window he saw her crouched beside one of the cots, adjusting a pillow beneath an older woman's head. Her own fatigue was etched into every line of her posture, but she kept going. He didn't knock. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he circled the block, parked around the corner, and sat for nearly an hour, wrestling with the weight of all he now knew. The guilt, the helpless admiration, the fury at a world that demanded so much from a woman like her, while giving so little back. And the unbearable fact that if he gave her money, or help, or rest, she would likely refuse again. Because to accept might feel like weakness. Because pride, battered and threadbare as it was still the only thing she truly owned. It was the following Monday when he first asked about her past. They were in the dining room, and she had just cleared his plate. The silence between them felt thicker now, charged with unsaid truths. Jonathan folded his hands, not looking at her directly. "Did you always live here? In Boston?" She hesitated, but only for a moment. "No. I moved here 7 years ago." "Before that?" She turned towards the sink. "Another state, another life." He let the silence linger, hoping she might offer more. She didn't. But the next morning, she did something unexpected. She left a book on the kitchen table. It wasn't hers, at least he didn't think it was, but it was placed there with intention. A worn paperback titled "Hope for the Broken Places." On the first page, an inscription, "For the ones who keep standing when no one sees them fall." He turned the pages slowly. Inside were case studies of community work, stories of trauma and recovery. At the back, in the acknowledgments, was a name. Grace Silva, field contributor. He read the chapter she had written. A quiet, thoughtful essay about systemic failure, about mothers who lose their children not because they don't love them, but because they are too poor to prove it. It spoke of laws twisted against those they were meant to protect, of shelters shutting their doors, of social workers fired for pushing too hard. He closed the book, his chest aching. That afternoon, while she scrubbed the stairs, he sat beside her with 2 coffees. She looked startled, but didn't stop him. "You used to be a social worker," he said. "Yes," she replied quietly, "until I wasn't." "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them until he almost pulled the words back. "There was a girl," she said finally. 7 years old. Her mother worked 3 jobs, couldn't afford daycare, left her home alone sometimes, not out of neglect, out of desperation. Jonathan listened, unmoving. "Someone reported her. The girl was taken. I tried to fight it, said it wasn't abuse, said we should support the mother, not punish her." Her hands paused on the railing. "I went on record, publicly. The agency didn't like that. They said I made them vulnerable, that I was endangering procedures. They fired me. And the girl." She looked up at him and he saw it then, how deeply that question still hurt. "She was adopted by another family. I never saw her again." He said nothing for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "that the system failed you and her." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "It's not about me. It's about what you do next after they break you." He thought about that all day, and the next, and the next. When the fire inspector tried to find the shelter for a broken alarm, Jonathan paid it anonymously. When the clinic couldn't approve a new MRI for a child due to funding caps, Jonathan covered it through an unaffiliated trust. Every time he tried to make her life easier, he did so without recognition. And yet, the balance was impossibly delicate. One afternoon, she found a new set of cleaning supplies in the kitchen. High-end, eco-safe, expensive. She stared at them for a long time before turning to him. "These weren't here before." "I had them delivered," he said evenly. She folded her arms. "Why?" "Because the ones we had were nearly gone, and you shouldn't be paying for replacements yourself." Her mouth tightened. "You notice that?" "I notice a lot more than I used to." She said nothing, but she left the supplies untouched for 2 days. He didn't argue. He waited. Eventually, she used them. The balance held, barely, But he knew it couldn't last, because the thing they both avoided saying, the truth pressing in from every corner, was that she needed help. Real help. Not soup cans and bedding and medicine smuggled in through kindness. Her daughter's life was hanging by a thread, and she could only pretend to hold it alone for so long. He had to find a way to break through, but not with money, not with pity, with something that could not be refused, with something that would feel not like saving her, but like standing beside her. And he had to find it soon, because the balance she walked, between pride and collapse, between duty and despair, was growing more fragile by the hour. The first cold snap of winter swept across Boston with little warning. The wind sharpened, biting through layers of wool and glass and distance, and the sky dimmed earlier each evening as if night had grown impatient for its dominion. Jonathan watched the season change from the comfort of his study, the fireplace flickering low, the silence now less comforting than ever before. Grace still came each morning with her quiet, determined step, still scrubbed and folded and wiped with a discipline that brooked no fatigue. But he could see it more clearly now, the pallor in her skin, the way her shoulders drooped a little lower when she thought she was alone, the slowness of her rising from a crouch. He had crossed some invisible line within himself, and there was no return to before. He could no longer act as if he didn't know. The illusion that he was simply an employer, and she merely an employee, had shattered with the truth he now carried. Grace was not just a housekeeper. She was a mother on the brink of losing the one thing that kept her breathing. And she was breaking. The problem was, she wouldn't let him help. He'd tried everything subtle, the supplies, the donations, the services delivered quietly to the shelter, even arranging medical transportation vouchers through a local nonprofit. Grace never commented, never asked, never thanked, but she must have known. The pattern had shifted. Food lasted longer, blankets were warmer, the clinic extended its hours. She wasn't ignorant. She was simply silent. And yet, she still refused everything personal. No to bonuses, no to more time off. No to higher wages. She answered every gesture with the same soft, final deflection. "Thank you, but I have what I need." It was a lie, and they both knew it. That was what haunted him most. Not her suffering, not even the child's illness, but the unbearable grace of her lies, lies that protected her dignity, lies that defended her boundaries, lies that said, even as her body shook from exhaustion, "I can carry this." Jonathan realized he couldn't offer her help, not in the traditional sense. She would never accept it. To her, charity meant pity, and pity meant surrender. It was the last thing she could afford. Dignity to Grace was not ornamental, it was structural. He needed another way, and so he offered her a promotion. It was a Friday morning, and she was in the pantry taking inventory, clipboard in hand, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. He approached slowly, coffee in one hand, documents in the other. "Grace," he said, clearing his throat, "I've been reviewing the operations of my charitable foundation. I'm thinking of expanding our work, particularly around community support for working families. I'd like you to join in a formal capacity." She looked at him, frowning slightly. "As what, exactly?" "Director of Domestic Outreach, salary increase, full benefits, health coverage for you and dependents, and flexible scheduling, of course. You could oversee community partnerships, develop programming. I'm a housekeeper, Mr. Crane." "You're more than that, Grace." She put the clipboard down gently and folded her arms. "I'm not qualified to run a foundation. You ran a shelter. You wrote professional essays. You coordinated social interventions for years. You're more than qualified. She shook her head. "Thank you, but no." He stared at her, frustration swelling. "Why not?" She didn't answer. Not at first. She simply walked to the counter and began sorting canned goods into rows. He waited. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, without looking at him. "But I need to stay where I am. I need the job I have. It pays half what you deserve. That's enough. And the hours? I manage." He wanted to shout, not out of anger, but anguish, because every calm word she spoke was another stone in the wall he could not climb. "Grace, your daughter." Her head snapped toward him, sharp as a blade. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but iron-willed. "You don't get to talk about my daughter." Jonathan's breath caught. "I'm trying to help," he said quietly. "I didn't ask." They stood in silence, the air between them dense and brittle. She picked up the clipboard again. "Please, don't offer things you can't understand." He left her alone then, not because he wanted to, but because he saw no choice. The more he pushed, the more she recoiled. And yet, he couldn't ignore the truth. Her rejection was not rooted in pride for pride's sake. It was survival. It was the one thread keeping her from unraveling completely. That evening, she left early. She said she had an appointment. He didn't follow. Instead, he went to the shelter. It was emptying for the night, most women already curled on their mats. He found one of the older residents, Maya, a former nurse with sharp eyes and a soft voice, and asked about Grace. "She sleeps in the basement," Maya said, "on a mat near the boiler. Won't take a bed unless we have extras. She's here every night? Every night. Works all day for you, all night for us. Eats maybe one real meal in between. She thinks we don't notice." He didn't answer. He couldn't. "She keeps us together," Maya added. "When the roof leaked, she found someone to patch it. When kids get sick, she runs to the clinic. When there's not enough food, she eats last. Always last." Jonathan looked at the ceiling, blinking hard. "She's dying on her feet," Maya said gently, "but she won't stop, not unless something forces her." That night, he made a decision. If Grace wouldn't let him help her, then he'd help the place she loved. But not just with money, with permanence, with structure, with something that couldn't vanish when the next crisis arrived. He spent the weekend drawing up plans. On Monday morning, he waited for her in the kitchen with a folder. When she entered, he handed it to her without ceremony. She opened it slowly, her brows drawn together. "What is this?" "A proposal. I bought the property next door to the clinic. I'm turning it into a full-service resource center. Housing, job training, childcare, legal aid, fully staffed, fully funded. I'd like you to run it." She stared at the pages, silent. "There's a model for financial sustainability, grants, endowments. I've already spoken to a few partner organizations. It could open in 6 months." Still, she didn't speak. "I'm not asking you to accept it for yourself," he continued. "I'm asking you to do it for them, for the women you protect, for the kids sleeping on concrete, for your daughter." Her fingers trembled slightly. "Why me?" "Because no one else knows what they need better than you do." She closed the folder. "I can't." "Why not?" "I don't want to owe you." "You don't." "I will." He stepped closer, his voice softer. "This isn't pity, Grace. This is partnership." She looked up at him, eyes wet, jaw tight. "You still don't understand. If I let someone else carry this, even for a moment, I might fall. I might not get back up." He exhaled slowly. "Then let me stand beside you. Not in front, not above, beside. She turned away, hands pressed flat against the counter. For a long moment, neither of them moved. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Let me think." He nodded. She left early again that day, and for the first time he didn't follow. Instead, he waited. The next morning, she came in with the same bag, the same clothes, the same quiet. But there was something else in her eyes now. A question, a possibility. They didn't speak of it. Not yet. But he saw the folder sticking out of her bag as she worked. And that was enough. The wall was still there, but a crack had begun to show. Winter deepened its grip on the city with a relentlessness that felt almost personal. The streets around Marion Street froze in patches of black ice. The wind bit through brick and flesh alike, and every breath hung visible in the air like a fragile warning. Inside Jonathan's house, warmth reigned. The floors were heated, the windows double insulated, the kitchen aglow with recessed lighting and the quiet hum of modernity. Yet, in spite of its comfort, the mansion felt colder than ever. Grace moved through the rooms as she always had, precise, composed, silent. She wore gloves more often now, thinner than they should have been for the weather, and her lips were sometimes chapped from wind that her jacket couldn't quite keep out. Jonathan noticed everything, but he said less and less. He had learned that words, no matter how well-intentioned, could be barricades if offered too freely. And Grace, for all her strength, was still surrounded by her invisible fortress. The folder, the proposal, had remained untouched on her corner of the kitchen shelf for a full week. She hadn't brought it up again. Neither had he. She hadn't refused it, but neither had she accepted. Every day, she walked in with it tucked under her arm or zipped inside her bag, always within reach, never opened in his presence. It had become a symbol of their impasse, his desire to help, her refusal to need. He began to sense that she was waiting. Not for more details, not for his persuasion, but for some internal shift. She needed something to change within her, something stronger than fear or pride. She needed a breaking point. And Jonathan, helpless to manufacture it, watched and waited with the quiet dread of someone who knew what breaking could look like. It came 2 days before Christmas. The morning started like any other. Snow had fallen during the night, light but insistent, layering the sidewalks in a delicate hush. Jonathan awoke early, brewed his coffee, and opened the news without reading it. Grace arrived on time, her cheeks red from wind, her breath sharp from cold. She nodded a soft greeting, removed her coat, and began her work. By mid-morning, he noticed her hand tremble as she folded towels in the laundry room. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. When he asked if she was all right, she gave the same answer she always did. "Just tired. I'm fine." But she wasn't. By noon, she had slowed considerably. She moved more carefully, leaned on the banister longer at the stairs, and seemed to brace herself each time she stood up from crouching. At 2 o'clock, she almost dropped a tray of dishes. He caught it just in time, his hand brushing hers. Her fingers were ice cold. "I think you need to sit down," he said more firmly than before. "I'm okay," she replied, even as her knees bent a fraction under her own weight. He didn't argue. He watched her leave the room, her steps unsteady. Then, at 4:20 in the afternoon, as she walked from the front hallway to the study carrying a box of decorations, she collapsed. It was not graceful. It was not quiet. Her legs buckled mid-step, her shoulder hit the edge of the door frame, and the box crashed to the floor with a shattering of glass ornaments and hollow echo. Jonathan was across the room in seconds. He dropped to his knees beside her, heart pounding, hands reaching. She was semi-conscious, her breath short and shallow, her skin alarmingly pale. Her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers. "Grace," he said, voice shaking, "stay with me." Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused. Her lips moved. "Don't call. Hospital. You need help. No hospitals. Please." Her hand clutched at his wrist with surprising strength. There was fear in her grip, a kind of desperation that went beyond pain. He didn't argue. Not yet. He lifted her carefully, carrying her to the living room sofa, laying her down as gently as he could. He covered her with a blanket, placed a pillow beneath her head, and sat on the floor beside her, unsure whether to be furious or terrified. She faded in and out of consciousness for the next 20 minutes, her fever rising, her body trembling in small waves. When she came to fully, sometime after 5, her voice was raspy but coherent. "I didn't sleep," she said. He stared at her. "Grace, when was the last time you slept a full night?" She didn't answer. He leaned closer. "And your daughter?" "She's okay," she whispered. "Last week, the clinic, good response, but not remission. No." He stood up, ran a hand through his hair, and turned away from her for a moment. The ache in his chest had grown unbearable. When he spoke again, his voice was tight. "You can't do this alone." "I have to." "No," he said, turning back to face her. "You don't. Not anymore." She closed her eyes. "I can't afford to believe that." He sat beside her again, quieter now. "Then let me believe it for you, until you can." They sat in silence. The snow outside had thickened into flurries. Somewhere in the distance, a siren moaned and faded. Grace pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she murmured. "I know. I didn't want to need you. I know that, too. But I do," she whispered. He didn't speak. He simply reached forward and took her hand, gently, without demand. She didn't pull away. That night, she didn't go to the shelter. She stayed on the sofa, her body too weak to argue, her will too frayed to resist. He called the clinic and had a nurse friend come over quietly. No ambulances, no sirens, just quiet help. The nurse gave her fluids, checked her vitals, and left antibiotics and instructions. Grace slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Jonathan stayed nearby the entire night. In the morning, she woke before dawn, blinking at the soft light filtering through the windows. He was already there, seated in the armchair, reading the same book she had once left for him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. I should have told you." "I think you did," he replied. "In your own way." She nodded. After a moment, she reached for her bag and pulled out the folder, the one she had carried for weeks. She held it between them for a moment, then placed it in his lap. "I'll do it," she said, "but only if we do it together." He didn't smile. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn motion as if something sacred had been entrusted to him. "And I'll need time," she added, "for Sophia, for the others, for myself, as much as you need." They sat together in that room, no longer strangers, no longer simply employer and employee. Something had broken the dam between them. Not charity, not logic, but shared humanity. A collapse, yes, but also a beginning. He brought her tea, and she stayed for the rest of the day, working in small moments, resting often. He didn't hover, he didn't fuss, he simply stayed present. That evening, as she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "You followed me that night," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes." She nodded. "I thought so." She didn't scold him. She didn't thank him. She just left. But the door she walked through no longer felt like a wall, and in its place something else had begun to rise. Not pride, not pity, something stronger, and far more enduring. The snow melted in early March, reluctantly peeling back its grip on the sidewalks and roofs, revealing the battered skin of the city beneath. Where once had been the hush of winter, there was now movement. Slow, hesitant, like someone waking from a long sleep and testing their limbs again. The streets near Marion Street became louder in small, hopeful ways. Children played on porches again. Someone strung bright paper flags between two utility poles. The faint sound of laughter sometimes carried through the evening air, brittle but brave. The season was changing, and something deeper shifted with it. So too had things begun to move between Grace and Jonathan, not abruptly, not with grand gestures, but like roots spreading quietly beneath the surface. She still came to work most mornings, but now her hours were different. Sometimes she arrived late, sometimes left early. Sometimes she brought Sophia with her, the little girl's scarf snug beneath her chin, her steps slow but determined as she wandered the wide hallways of a house that felt more like a gallery than a home. Jonathan had a cabinet in the living room stocked now with children's books and a box of puzzles on the lowest shelf. Grace had never asked for that. He had simply placed them there one evening after Sophia's first visit, and Grace had given him a long look, something unreadable, somewhere between caution and quiet approval. They no longer avoided the past. Grace spoke of her years in the social system, her failures, her fury, her love for a job that had broken her heart. Jonathan shared stories about Rebecca, about the days before grief became architecture in his life. They spoke not as savior and survivor, but as two people who had each lost something irreplaceable and chosen, somehow, to keep walking anyway. The proposal they had once fought over had evolved into a plan. Permits were submitted, contractors interviewed, community boards notified. It was no longer theoretical. It had foundation lines and deadlines and blueprints. Jonathan met with local organizations who knew the needs Grace could name from memory. A law clinic volunteered 2 interns. A nonprofit from Somerville offered job training support. An anonymous donor, a shadow Grace never asked about, funded the first full year of operations. And then there was the house. The property Jonathan had purchased, a brick building nestled between the clinic and an old church, had once been a boarding house. It had fallen into disrepair after a fire 2 decades earlier and sat dormant, boarded and forgotten. But the bones of the structure were strong. Jonathan had seen it the day after Grace collapsed. The neighborhood children had been using the front porch as a play area. Someone had spray-painted a faded sun on the door. There was something poetic about it. A burned-out shell waiting to be repurposed, waiting for someone to believe it could matter again. Construction began in early April. The first day, Grace stood beside him as the crews arrived, tools slung over shoulders, blueprints in hand. She was quiet, arms crossed against her chest, and he wondered for a moment if she would change her mind. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer at first. Her eyes were fixed on the old structure. "I used to think I'd never build anything that lasted," she said finally. "Everything I touched either fell apart or was taken away." He looked at her profile, sharp and still against the gray morning sky. "This will last," he said. She didn't nod, but she stayed. The days that followed were filled with more than permits and paint. Grace threw herself into the work with a quiet intensity. She met with every subcontractor. She helped design the intake rooms, the playroom, the shared kitchen. She sat in endless meetings about code compliance and accessibility. At night, she still returned to Marion Street, where the shelter now ran smoother, bolstered by the services Jonathan had funded and Grace had managed from behind the scenes. She had stepped into a different kind of leadership, not the fragile martyrdom she had worn before, but something steadier, rooted. She asked for things now, sometimes plainly, sometimes with hesitation, but she asked. Jonathan watched all of this with a kind of reverence. It wasn't love, or not yet, and he was careful never to push. But something had settled in his chest, a calm he hadn't known in years. Being near her, witnessing her work, her discipline, her quiet war against despair, had changed him. He woke earlier now. He spent fewer evenings alone with his bourbon. He returned phone calls. He laughed, sometimes, without guilt. The house became a symbol. And then, 3 weeks before it was due to open, Grace didn't show up. Jonathan waited until 10, then 11, then noon. She wasn't at the shelter. She wasn't answering her phone. At 1, he drove to the clinic. He found her in exam room 2, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes red. Sophia lay on the table beside her face pale, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. A nurse hovered in the corner, chart in hand, eyes downcast. Jonathan entered without asking permission. The nurse looked up, startled. Grace didn't look at him. "They're transferring her," she said flatly. "Tomorrow, Mass General. She'll need full-time care. She's not responding anymore." He stepped closer carefully. "Grace, I won't be able to run the center. You don't know that." "I do." She finally looked at him then, eyes burning. "She's dying." He didn't speak. "I can't save her." He wanted to argue, to offer hope, to fight against the inevitable. But he didn't. He sat beside her and placed his hand over hers. "I know," he said quietly. "She asked me what the house will look like." He nodded. "I told her it would have a garden," she continued, her voice cracking, "that we'd plant flowers together. We still can." Grace closed her eyes. That night, he sat in the hospital's family waiting room while Grace curled beside her daughter, who slept beneath a cartoon blanket with a stuffed lion tucked under her chin. The nurses came and went. Machines beeped softly. The world felt unbearably still. 2 days later, Sophia was stable enough to come home, but it was temporary. A hospice nurse came 3 times a week. Grace moved into a room at Marion Street with her daughter. Jonathan offered his home. She declined, but not sharply, just gently. "I want her to be around other kids," she said, "even if she can't play. I want her to hear laughter." Jonathan nodded. He visited often, bringing soup, books, anything he could think of. He stayed on the edges, never intruding. Grace allowed this, and sometimes when the days were quiet, she let him read to Sophia while she rested. On one of those visits, Sophia looked up at him and asked, "Did you build a house for my mom?" He paused. "Yes," he said, "for her, and for you." She smiled, sleepy. "Can I live there?" "You'll always have a place there." She closed her eyes. "Tell her not to make it all gray." He laughed softly. "I will." The house opened in late June. Grace stood on the porch with a small group of women from the shelter. Jonathan beside her. There was no ribbon cutting, no press, no ceremony, just a few families, a breeze through the open windows and the smell of new paint and possibility. There was a garden in the back, just as Sophia had imagined. Grace had planted the first seeds herself. Sunflowers, lavender, tomatoes. The soil still held her fingerprints. Inside, the walls were painted in soft greens and blues. Each room held light, not just from the windows, but from something more subtle. The sense that whoever entered was meant to be there, not as a burden, but as someone worth holding space for. That evening, when the last guest had gone, Grace sat on the front steps beside Jonathan, watching the sky shift from amber to indigo. "I didn't think I could do it," she said. "You did." "I didn't think I was allowed to." He looked at her, the woman who had once believed she could only serve others, never build for herself. "You are," he said. "You always were." She didn't reply, but she reached over and took his hand. And for a moment, in the quiet hum of summer dusk, it felt like something permanent had been built. Not just the house, not just the garden, but the beginning of a life that neither of them thought they'd live long enough or bravely enough to claim. The garden behind the new center had bloomed beyond expectation. By mid-July, sunflowers towered like sentinels against the back fence. Tomatoes ripened along their vines, and lavender perfumed the air with every breeze. It became a gathering place, informal, sacred in its own humble way. Children played among the raised beds. Women sat on benches, shelling peas or braiding hair or simply letting the sun warm their faces without fear of interruption. Grace watched all of it with the wariness of someone who knew how fragile peace could be. Sophia was not there to see it. She passed quietly, 2 weeks before the official opening, in the shelter room she had come to call her castle. The hospice nurse had been with them. So had Maya and a handful of others from Marion Street. Jonathan came soon after, not because Grace asked him, but because she didn't have to. There was no funeral in the traditional sense. No procession, no white lilies or suits, just a gathering in the garden, Sophia's blanket laid across the grass, and a box of crayons at the center of a wooden table. Grace had asked every child who knew Sophia to draw her a picture, something bright, something she would have loved. They taped them to a string that looped from tree to tree, fluttering like prayer flags. Jonathan stood behind her as she read each one. When she cried, it was soundless, her shoulders barely moving. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply stayed. The days after blurred. She stopped coming to the mansion entirely, not out of anger, not in rejection, but because whatever energy she had left needed to be spent where the wound had occurred. She cleaned the shelter by hand. She organized storage closets and recatalogued medicine cabinets. She swept the garden paths at dawn and again at dusk. The staff at the new center offered to take over. She refused. Grief for Grace was labor. Jonathan returned to his estate and found it impossibly large again. The silence, once familiar, now itched against the walls. He tried to work. He tried to distract himself with numbers and contracts and the endless drudgery of foundation logistics. None of it took. His thoughts kept drifting, to the last time Sophia had asked him to tell her a story, to the way Grace had clutched her daughter's hand in those final hours, as if she could tether her to the earth through sheer force of will. He returned to the center after a week. Grace was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from the edge of a marigold patch. She didn't look up when he approached. He waited until she finished the row. Then she sat back on her heels and finally met his gaze. "You're still here," she said. "I wasn't going anywhere." They sat together in the dirt for a while, wordless. Bees buzzed somewhere overhead. The wind moved the leaves. The garden felt like a quiet breath the city had forgotten to exhale. "I kept the center open during the afternoons," she said after a while. "For the mothers, the ones who need a few hours to think." He nodded. "And I added a music room. We had some volunteers bring instruments. Sophia always wanted to learn guitar." He said nothing, but a tightness gripped his throat. "I want her name on the building," she added. Jonathan turned. "You're sure?" Yes. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. She looked at him, surprised. "I've had the new sign ready since last month," he said. "Was just waiting for you to ask." She laughed unexpectedly. It was short and raw and ended in tears. The next morning, they installed it together, a simple plaque beside the door, etched in bronze. The Sophia Brooks Community House. Below it, in smaller letters, "For the ones we hold and the ones we let go." From that day forward, everything changed. Grace no longer divided herself into roles. She stopped being only the woman who cleaned, or only the mother who suffered, or only the survivor who rebuilt. She became a full presence in the center and in her own life. She spoke to city council members with calm authority. She drafted policy recommendations. She was invited to speak on panels and gave interviews to local newspapers. Every success was humble, every decision measured. But the Grace who had once refused help now knew how to accept partnership. And the Grace who had once lived in secrecy now moved with quiet defiance in full view of the world. Jonathan remained beside her. Not as a benefactor, though the center continued to receive anonymous support from his various funds. Not as a suitor, though something between them had undeniably shifted into a deeper, quieter bond. He remained simply as a man who had once watched her collapse and decided, in that moment, that he would never again let her carry the weight alone. They began to have dinner together. Not often, not with candles or expectation, but in the kitchen of the center after hours, once the volunteers had left and the children had been picked up. He would bring takeout, or she would warm something simple, and they'd talk. Not about Sophia, though sometimes her name came, soft and unexpected, but about books, about music, about nothing at all. He told her about his late wife for the first time in full. She listened without pity. He never asked her for more than she gave. One evening, late in September, Grace brought him into the music room. A small child was plucking at a ukulele, off-key and delighted. Grace watched for a moment, then leaned against the wall beside him. "She would have liked this," she said. "I know. And I'm glad you followed me." He turned to her. "That night," she said, "back then, I was furious. But if you hadn't, I don't know if we'd be here now." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering the last petals of summer across the yard. The garden had begun to thin, but there was still color in it, still life, stubborn and brave. Later that year, they held a winter festival at the center. The children sang in the music room, their voices high and laughing. Volunteers built snowmen. The mayor visited briefly and tried to shake every hand. Grace wore a dark coat and a red scarf and watched from the steps. Jonathan stood beside her, his hand brushing hers, not holding, not yet. But her fingers curled slightly toward his. And in the frost of a new season, what remained between them was not only sorrow, but something else. Something rooted, something tender, something alive. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our other videos for more powerful stories like this one. And if this meant something to you, share it.